So today we have with us two speakers from two different research projects. The two are Regina Bateson, an assistant professor in the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, and also Giancarlo Visconti, an assistant professor of political science at Purdue University and a core faculty in the Advanced Methods cluster there. So I'll hand it over to y'all now.
All right. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here with you today and crazy to be giving a joint presentation with someone who's not my co-author. Today, you're hearing from representatives from two different teams of people who completed very similar projects at about the same time. And there's a happy ending. We were both able to publish our work in the end. And I think we've learned a lot from the experience of looking at each other's work too. So I'm really happy to get to share that with you today. All right. So I want to start by taking you back to November 2016. Feels like a long time ago. But on November 8th, 2016, the US presidential election was approaching. And it was contested. Most people, I think, thought that Clinton was going to win, but there were certainly strong feelings on both sides. And when the results came out that night, some folks were elated, celebrating. Other folks were shocked and crestfallen. And this was an election that resonated around the world. So it wasn't just Americans who were following it closely, or even folks in North America, but people in Europe, people in Latin America as well. And at the same time that the election results were becoming known, there was a survey in the field. It was the LabHope AmericasBarometer survey for 2016, 2017. And in multiple countries, they had enumerators on the ground conducting their interviews before and after the results of the election were known. Both of us on these two different research teams have exploited this unexpected event during survey enumeration as leverage for causal inference, essentially looking at this as a natural experiment that we can see how people's views shifted from right before they knew that Donald Trump was going to be the next president of the United States to the very next days after when the results of the election were known. So now I'm going to pass things over to Giancarlo to tell us a bit more about the survey and the data.
Perfect. And so as Regina mentioned, these are two different projects, but we have exactly the same goal, which is to learn what is the causal impact of one particular contextual factor, which is the result of a presidential election. But that is not something easy to do. So if just to provide one example, we want to learn what is the effect, what is the causal impact of electing a far right-wing president, such as Bolsonaro in Brazil. And to do that, we compare people that participated in a survey before the election with people that participated in the survey after the election. It might happen that there is an anticipation effect, that the people that answered before the actual election, in a way, updated their preferences, whatever we want to study, right? Democratic attitudes before Bolsonaro was elected because he was a likely winner. So as a way to try to address this concern, this anticipation effect, we take advantage of what we believe are the unexpected results of the 2016 presidential election in the US. We provide evidence, both research projects provide evidence from the local media, because they depict the election as having a very clear winner, that was Hillary Clinton. We're able to take advantage of that. And we combine these unexpected results with the timing of the LabHope survey, right? The Latin American Public Opinion a project that was on the field in different Latin American countries in November 2016. And we're able to study and to take advantage of that to learn what is the causal effect of a presidential election. If we go to the next slide, here I'm going to depict or talk a little bit about the outcome. So in both projects, we use the same outcome, which is trust in the US government. The structure of this outcome in the survey, in the LabHope question, is a 4-point scale variable that goes from not at all trustworthy, this is a 1, to 4, which is very trustworthy. And also both projects use a binary version of this, which is, in our case, is a little bit different. And this is also our main outcome of interest, the binary version, in where 1 means that the respondent says that the US government is very or somewhat trustworthy, and 0 is otherwise for us. We do that to try to address concern about missing values, because it might happen that missingness correlates with the election, right? So after the election of Trump, you just become more politicized about US politics, or you care more about this question, right? Trust in the US. So you become more likely to answer, or maybe less likely to answer. We don't know. To not have missing values in our outcome, we use this approach So our binary variable is actually a measure of directly saying that you trust in the US. And 0 is otherwise, which might mean you don't answer, you're not sure, or you don't trust in the US. But we also use the traditional dependent variable with missing values in the appendix, and we get similar results. In the next slide, I will talk a little bit about the treatment. Even though the treatment is the same in both projects, the way we approach to measure exposure to Trump, if you want to name it like that, is a little bit different. So the treatment in a way is measuring if you were interviewed after the 2016 presidential election. So after November 8th, the day after that night. In the case of Regina and Michael paper, what they have is 1, if you were interviewed on or after November 9th. So this is after the election 9. That's going to be a 1, a 0 if you were interviewed before. To get to that treatment, we have a slightly different process because we're using a regression discontinuity design, as I'm going to explain later. So the first thing we need to do is to construct the score or the running variable, which is in this case the difference between the day you participated, right, November 20, and the day after the election 9, or the day of the election 9, right? November 9, November 8. So that score is going to have positive or negative values based on the cutoff, which is the night of the election or the first day after the election. So if you have positive scores, if you have positive values in your score, it means that you were interviewed after the election, right? If the value is 1, it means you were interviewed 1 day after the election, 2 days after the election. And if your score is -3, it means that you were interviewed 3 days before the election. And the positive values are the treatment, right? Having Trump as the president-elect rather than having Trump as a presidential candidate. So as you can see, the treatment are the same, but the way we get to the treatment is a little bit different. And then it's going to be relevant that for the actual estimation of the Trump effect. So in the next slide, I'm going to briefly talk a little bit about the covariates that I also think is relevant, right? So in our paper, which is a CVA paper, right, we use 4 what we call placebo covariates. These are like survey respondents characteristics that we believe shouldn't be affected by the election, like the age, education, the gender of the respondent, self-reported gender, and the and geographic location. But we use that to check for what is called in our regression discontinuity design a continuity assumption. So we want to show to people that these covariates do not have an abrupt change at the cutoff. They have a smooth transition at the cutoff. So the only thing that is actually changing at the cutoff is the election of Trump and not the sample characteristic or the respondent characteristic. In the case of Regina and Michael, they use the same covariates. They include others such as voter registration, voting history that were quite interesting to incorporate. We didn't think about using that, but I think that's a great idea. But they use them as a control, right? They have a different goal in the research design, which is also quite interesting, right? So we rely on covariates, the same covariates, but for different goals, right? In our case, was to check for one assumption. In their case, they use as a control to actually also hold one of the assumptions, which is the conditional independence. That I will briefly talk about that later. So in the next slide, I think I'm going to talk about our design. Now I will be just talking about our paper, in where what we use is something that's called a regression discontinuity design in time, which is quite similar to a traditional RDD, right? We have a running variable, but rather than being the margin of victory, right, when using elections, is time and expressed in days. And the treatment, rather than winning an election, the traditional RDD we use in political science, the threshold is actually the day of the election, something that happened in this particular amount of time. So every unit, and units in this case that are the survey respondents, are going to have a score. And as I mentioned before, when you're above the score, you're treated. When you're below the score, so if you were interviewed before the election, you are considering the control group, the cutoff being the night of the election. So in the next slide, I'm going to just briefly talk a little bit about the regression, the estimation equation we use. This is a traditional way to estimate RDDs, in where we are regressing our outcome. So our main outcome is this binary measure of trust in the US. We also use the 4-point scale in the appendix. We regress that on the treatment if you're above or below the cutoff. S is the score, which is 5 means you were interviewed 5 days after the survey, minus 10 days before the survey. The interaction between these two things that is just helpful for the flexibility at the cutoff. But the coefficient of interest here is beta 1, is the treatment, is the effect of the election of Trump at the cutoff, right? This is a very local effect, what we're getting, right? We're getting what is the effect of having Trump as the winner, as the president-elect, the day of the election, right, at the cutoff. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit more about our design. If we have an RDD, we need to find a bandwidth, right? The bandwidth are the values of the score that are going to define our sample, right? So what we use, the main bandwidth is an optimal bandwidth. So it's a data-driven process that is not up to us, but up to the type of optimal bandwidth we are using, which is called an MSE bandwidth. And this type of bandwidth, what it's doing is looking for a trade-off between bias and variance. So if we have a very small bandwidth, 2 days after and 2 days before the election, we're going to reduce the bias because we're going to end up comparing people that are quite similar to each other. But we're going to increase the variance because we're going to have a very small sample. If we have a very large bandwidth, we're going to do the opposite, right? We're going to increase the bias because we will be comparing people that might be very different and reduce the variance. So this bandwidth, what it's doing is finding the equilibrium between these two different things. And the recommendation is at 5 days. So 5 days before the election of Trump, 5 days after, that's the main bandwidth, right? To estimate the equation number 1. But on top of that, we follow quite interesting paper by Natalia Bueno and Guadalupe Tuñón, in where they recommend that rather than just reporting the optimal bandwidth, just show a battery of bandwidth in exactly the same plot. So in a way, you're providing the main effects and the robustness check at the same time. So we provide evidence from more than 30 different bandwidths providing different treatment effects. And on top of that, we also weight the observation. This is following most of the work done by Rocio Titunik and other people on RDDs. And the idea here is that when you're closer to the cutoff, you're more valuable to the estimation, right? And when you get far away from the cutoff, you become less valuable, right? So there is a weighting scheme behind the estimation. And I think that I have the results on the next slide. And here in the x-axis, you have the bandwidth. So the red dot and confidence interval is for the optimal bandwidth when the bandwidth is equal to 8. So minus 8 days and plus 8 days. And we can see that the treatment effect, so the effect of having Trump as the winner at the cutoff is a decrease in trust on the US in 10 percentage points, right? Because we have a binary variable. And that effect is quite consistent across all the different bandwidths, which is in a way, I believe like it's enough strong evidence that actually something is happening, right? This is not just in one bandwidth, but in more than 30 different bandwidths. And finally, let me briefly talk about some of the robustness check we have. Yeah, thank you, Regina. The next slide is fine. Yeah. We conducted a battery of different robustness check, right? Which is also something that has become quite common. And I will just briefly talk about 3 of them, but there are more. We check the placebo covariates if they have a smooth transition at the cutoff, which is what I say later before. A second robustness check is that we change the day of the election, right? We say, let's imagine that the election happened in November 1st. If that's the case, that will be the new cutoff. We will expect to see no result because there was nothing happened on November 1st. Or let's say that the election happened in November 21st. So again, we shouldn't expect a result because people before and after that day already knew that Trump was the president-elect. We do that and we find that if we change the cutoff, we don't find effects. And we also use placebo outcomes, for example, trust in local government. I also think that there is some overlap in terms of the robustness check we are doing with the robustness check that Regina and Michael. And as a conclusion, I think I have now, the last slide. Something that I think that is really interesting about these 2 different projects where we use the same treatment and the same outcome is that we have 2 very different empirical approaches that relied on different identification assumptions. So if you go to the next, right, as Regina and Michael, they relied on what's called a conditional independence assumption. After adjusting on some observables, we can assume that people that were interviewed before the election and after the election are similar to each other, right, in expectation. We should be able to make a comparison between them. But we relied on a different one, what is called a continuity assumption. So we expect that at the cutoff, at the day of the election, we're going to have a smooth transition for everything, with the exception of exposure to having Trump as the winner, right? The Trump effect. And in both cases, we're finding the same result, which is a deterioration of trust in the US. And finally, as a more substantive conclusion, if you have a chance to read the paper, they also have a different framing, right? It's not just that we use a different approach. The three of us in the team, we do a lot of research on Latin American politics, and we try to frame it with respect to that literature. And something that we believe is interesting about these findings is that they don't go against, but they complement more traditional approaches that hold that anti-American attitude or attitudes toward the US tend to be explained by slow-moving factors, like what is your economic relationship with the US, or how close or how far you are from the US, or other type of slow-moving variables like ideological stances. So left-wing voters might have a different appreciation of the US than right-wing voters in Latin America. And what we show here is that these contextual factors that are not related with these slow-moving processes also have an impact on how people understand and appreciate them or trust in the US government. But it's also important to discuss this idea of the ambivalence, right? So one thing is the US government, but also something different is the US as a country or the US culture, and in where people might respect that or might like that, but at the same time not like the US government. So that ambivalence is also something relevant to have in mind when we talk about anti-American attitudes in Latin America. Thank you, Regina, for helping me with this slide.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Giancarlo. So I'm going to go ahead and talk about our paper now, the paper that I wrote with Michael Weintraub from the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. I'm out back. Okay, so Giancarlo did a great job talking through the setup. It's really fascinating to hear about the methods and the assumptions that underlie their approach to this data. We took a slightly different approach. So one of the differences to start with is that there were actually 5 countries where LAPOC was in the field during the 2016 election. There's also Venezuela. And so pretty early on, Michael, and I'll be honest, it was really me in particular, there were some differences about how the data was collected in Venezuela. The survey period was drawn out over a much longer period of time and kind of irregular in its spacing. And I also just had concerns about asking about public opinion toward the United States in Venezuela, and that might be substantively different than any other countries. So we dropped out Venezuela in the beginning. And as you'll see, it doesn't really actually matter substantively for the results, but it was one of the differences between the two groups. So these are the 4 countries that are included in our paper. And as Giancarlo was saying earlier, and as we've explained, these are histograms that are showing how many interviews were conducted per day in each of those 4 countries. And so you can see that the fieldwork was proceeding and that there's a good number of people who were interviewed on each of the days before the election and each of the days after the election in those 4 countries that we focused on. So initially, we started thinking about this as a regression discontinuity also, which is why it's really interesting to see where your paper went, because that was the initial intuition that we had, was that it felt like a regression discontinuity. But ultimately, and thanks to guidance from reviewers, our paper went through a lot of rounds of review. We were eventually directed to this article, which I thought was really helpful, and it really shaped the way that we ultimately did the final version of our analysis. So I just wanted to throw it out here because I think it's a great resource if you're interested in trying to use an unexpected event during survey enumeration for your research. It's very doable, and this is a great how-to guide that we relied on heavily from Munoz, Falco Jimeno, and Hernandez. Very helpful. All right, so we relied on 4 key assumptions in setting up our project, as Giancarlo has hinted at. So the first was that Trump's victory was unanticipated. And so we took a dive into media coverage, tried to use other means of showing that it was, in fact, unanticipated in Latin America. And so you can see here one of the headlines from a newspaper in Honduras from the day of the election, telling us that the US is voting today with Hillary as the favorite. And so the coverage that we found was either promoting Hillary as the likely winner or was neutral, was saying that it was a toss-up or the outcome was unknown. Couldn't really actually find any news coverage in Latin America predicting that Trump was going to win. All right, so our next assumption is that, this is also illustrating 2 things. First, that the outcome was unexpected from the election, again, and also that the election was a highly salient event. So that's our second assumption, is that the election was salient, that people knew the outcome of the election, and that they knew it quickly, even the day after the election. So this is one of the headlines that we found from the morning after the election, which is Trump, the world wakes up upside down, basically. Okay. And we also showed that this was true across the countries we were studying. So we had some skepticism from reviewers at times about whether people in Paraguay, they were particularly concerned about Paraguay. Were Paraguayans really following the election? Yes, they were. We found evidence of election watching parties happening in Paraguay. We found a lot of social media engagement. Yes, everyone was following this election around the world. We also went ahead and looked at Google search trends. And so we wanted to see that, again, that people were paying attention and that they actually were aware that Trump had won the election and that they were aware quickly. And so we looked at how searches for Clinton and Trump were fairly steady before the election. And then on November 9th, starting midnight and after local time on November 9th, you see this huge spike in searches about Trump and a spike for Clinton, but a much smaller spike. And so that suggested to us that, again, people knew an election happened. They knew that across Latin America. And there was this increase in interest in Trump all of a sudden, or searches for news about him, perhaps, as it became clear that he looked like the winner. Okay, our next assumption is excludability, that other concurrent events didn't also influence the outcome at the same time. And we addressed that through our news searches and media searches as well. And then the final assumption is ignorability, the idea that subjects were assigned to treatment and control as if randomly. And here we really need to show, as Giancarlo already explained, that the people who were surveyed just before and just after the election are similar to each other. And if they're not, we need to control for that, or we use fixed effects at different points throughout this. We did some balancing. We did a lot of things to try to deal with any imbalances between these two groups. And so this gives you an idea of some of the key covariates that we looked at. And we looked at the full sample and then different bandwidths around election day. And for us, the thing that really jumped out was the size of the location where the respondent lives. Are they in a small town? Are they in a big city? Are they in a national capital? Are they in a rural area? And there were differences when we look at either a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks before and after the election. And we went on a deep dive into how LAPWOB does its enumeration. And we felt that this made sense because in most countries, they start in the national capital and then they fan out to larger cities and then they move forward from there. So there is a geographic pacing and a geographic strategy that they're using when they're there on the ground. And so this was something that we controlled for and dealt with in multiple different ways throughout the paper. All right, and there you have size of location highlighted. Okay, so I'll jump ahead to our main results. And it's quite interesting that in addition to using different methods with different assumptions, we ultimately end up reaching substantively the same conclusion, which is that the drop in trust in the US government was about 10 percentage points. And what we're showing here is, again, a slightly different way of showing those results. It was recommended to us in the article that I'd referenced. And so the black plots are the ones to really pay attention to. That's showing the treatment effect, which is negative and statistically significant across all these different model specifications here. We also, again, on the advice of reviewers, ended up doing another model that has an interaction between a running variable, that's called days here. It's an interaction between our original treatment variable and a running variable that measures days before and after the election, with the day after the election. So the first day of the treatment is coded as 0. And so basically what this is showing us is it allows us to see if the effect was observed immediately. So was there an immediate effect on the day right after the election, or did it take longer to develop? And in some of the models, the confidence intervals are crossing 0. In the full sample, they don't. And the standard errors do seem to blow up when people use this structure in other papers. So we weren't surprised to see that. But this is suggestive that it's possible that the result happened right on the day after the election. And then there wasn't really, as Giancarlo already showed us this plot, there isn't really actually a time trend after that. It's fairly stable after that. All right, so those were the main results. And we also did something similar to what Giancarlo and his team did, in that we repeated our main results for all different bandwidths, because there were a lot of questions about what's the optimal bandwidth to be using, the number of days before and after the election. And so you can see here that we plotted all the way back to a bandwidth of just 1 or 2 days here, whereas Giancarlo's plot started at, I think, 5 days. And so you can see that if you're using a very narrow bandwidth, the standard errors are going to be huge. you getting unreliable point estimates with just 1 or 2 days before the next of the election. However, once you start getting into 5, 6, 7, 8 days, the effect stabilizes. We did have more concerns about imbalances between the two groups the farther out we went from the election. So that's why we ultimately went with a bandwidth of 7 days in our project, which is very similar to where Giancarlo and his team ended up. Okay. We also looked at this by country. For us, it was interesting to see with the effect being driven by just one country or not. And countries start with different levels of trust in the US government. People in the Dominican Republic expressed very high levels of trust in the US government, less so in the other countries that were surveyed. And it's interesting, though, that the effect is actually a pretty similar size across all of those countries. So even a place like the Dominican Republic responded similarly to people in places like El Salvador or Honduras who might have felt more personally threatened by Donald Trump and some of the rhetoric that he used. Okay, and then we have some placebo tests also, so similar to the strategy employed by the other folks from the other paper. We did a faux election placebo test. So we basically set an arbitrary date for an election to look for any time trend effects that might be in the data otherwise. And I believe that we picked our date as like the median of the pre-treatment period because we needed to have enough observations on both sides for the different countries. And so we picked a date that was just before the election and then looked at people on both sides. And so we see that actually returns null results in contrast when we use the date of the real election. Okay, and then for our other placebo tests, we used some different dependent variables. Giancarlo and team had used, I think it was trust in local government, if I remember correctly. Okay. We decided to look at trust in other foreign government. Is there just something about people that were surveyed later in this process that makes them less trusting of international entities or more skeptical toward international actors? And so it's interesting that even the OAS, which is perhaps more closely associated with the US, we don't really see an effect there. We don't see changes in trust in China or trust in the UN either. So for us, this was reassuring and suggested that there was something specific about the impact of the election that changed people's views toward the United States. All right, so I'll just say thank you quickly. I think that we should all probably, I'll particularly thank Liz Zeckmeister, who walked us through some of the enumeration processes used by the America's Barometer folks in great detail. We're thanking our reviewers. We had our research assistant who helped us at different points, Cassandra Mercier, and of course, thanking LAPOP, its major supporters, USAID, the Inter-American Development Bank, and Purdue University. And I have one more thank you. Oh, and sorry, this is our contact information in case you want to reach Michael or I. My other thank you, though, is to a couple biologists. Jin-Soo Kim and Jacob Korn wrote a really interesting piece after they scooped each other. One of them was the scooper and one of them was the scoopee. And they both ended up publishing their work and then wrote about it. And for us, it was really shocking to make it through multiple rounds of review and have worked on something for a year and a half or more in a pandemic. And then to find out suddenly through social media that someone else had also written a very similar paper. Their paper had gotten accepted slightly before ours, although ultimately they were published within days of each other, I think. That was a bit shocking from our perspective. And we weren't sure how to handle that. And took a few days to think about it, or maybe just a day. But we found this article and this particular column and these two sets of authors writing about their experience really shaped the way we moved forward. And I think changed our feelings and our thinking about the situation. And it's been really productive, I think, to reach out to you guys, to get to know you, and to see what you've done with the project too. So today, I think we're really happy to share those insights with the rest of the group.
Thank you both. That was really amazing. What I find particularly interesting and helpful, particularly for graduate students, is the message that just because someone else is working on a similar or even the exact same research question doesn't mean you can't do your thesis or that the gap has closed in the literature, that all is lost. Because I have conversations with anxious PhD students, for instance, who find out that someone else is working in the same area and think, oh no, my opportunity is lost. And so this kind of shows that that's not necessarily the case, that there's plenty of room for lots of people to investigate interesting questions. And then the second thing that I think is also really comforting and reaffirming of some things that I try to teach my students in my methods classes is that if there's a pattern there in the data, you will find it. And so I recognize that a lot of our models have a bunch of really sometimes exigent assumptions that need to be met and certain kind of requirements in terms of distributions of the dependent variable or other things. But I think what your analyses show is that kind of if there's really something there, you will find it. And that to some extent, these methods, even though they come from different starting assumptions, end up being very similar in the specification and in the interpretation of the results and the effect sizes. And so that also, I feel, should be reassuring to students that kind of are learning methods and growing their expertise about whether or not they've analyzed their data correctly or not. And are there other methods that are more appropriate? Which is to say that if you've tried it a couple of different ways and you get the same answer, you're probably onto something. On the other hand, if you tried a couple of different ways and get radically different answers, you should be checking more closely of what's going on. So I have a couple of questions, but I'm wondering if it would be good if there's anyone in our audience that wants to ask a question. You can put it in the chat or you can unmute yourself and ask. You can feel free. So I want to give you a chance to do that before I jump in. All right, I'll let you think a little bit more while I ask a question. One of the things that both of your studies did that I am seeing more frequently in political science articles than in the last few years than before is the use of placebos, and particularly choosing a different outcome variable as a placebo test. And I'm interested to hear you both, because you both adopted this strategy, but then used different outcomes as the placebos and found in both instances that they were in fact placebos. I'd be curious to have you talk a little bit more for our audience about how you thought about which questions would be good placebos and what the logic is of choosing a different outcome variable as a placebo, because that can, I think, be done in a lot of different instances, even when you don't have a quasi-experimental design and have observational data. So I was intrigued by that part of it because I feel like that's a trend that I've seen in recent publications that is newer, I'd say.
Giancarlo, do you want to start perhaps?
So the main idea with this placebo test or falsification test is to try to show to people that there is no effect on places where you expect to see no effect. We only expect to see an effect of the Trump elections on things that we can relate to the US, such as trust in the US. And then we need to try to find outcomes that are not related whatsoever with the understanding that people might have about the US. So that part was a little bit hard, right? We read the questionnaires multiple times, tried to find some things that we believe were not related or people cannot relate to the US. And this question about local governments, we thought we think this is perfect, right? So it's just hard to imagine that because of the election of Trump, that's going to change the way you evaluate your own municipality or the work your municipality is doing, right? These things are just, we believe, are independent from each other. And finding a very clear null finding might work as evidence that this is only affecting one thing and not other things, but also that this is a real effect. This is not something that is just happening there and is affecting multiple things, because at the end, maybe it's not affecting anything, right? It's just happened to correlate with multiple things. And that was the main idea with the falsification test. We also use placebo covariates, but for something different, but that was the goal with the placebo outcome.
Okay, thanks. So I'll just quickly, again, a lot of our concerns about the data and our assumptions did center around this issue of geography and location. And it felt like a hint of a clue that there was something different about the people that were surveyed later versus the people that were surveyed earlier. And I remember we tried to brainstorm this every possible way, right? How could this possibly be a problem? And at one point we thought maybe people are in smaller towns, maybe they're in more rural areas, maybe they're just less internationalist or less kind of global. For some countries, people in rural areas actually have a lot of strong ties to the US, a lot of migration back and forth. So I'm not sure how concerned we should have been about that, but we thought about it in those terms. So we were, also concerned about potential differences in trust that might be unrelated from the election, but we particularly thought about it in terms of beliefs about international entities and international actors. And so how did we choose our placebos? We took a look through all the questions of trust in the survey, but we felt trying to make sure there was nothing different about the way people surveyed later in the process, saw the UN or saw the OAS. To us, that was reassuring, because you can imagine if someone just really dislikes the international system and just dislikes international actors, generally, that's a reason why we might find this fact, right? Even if it had kind of nothing to do with the election of Donald Trump specifically. And so we felt like that gave us, using those particular placebo outcomes, gave us version.
And I think also hearing you both talk about this and the lesson or what you learned about the way that enumeration proceeds from kind of capital cities to larger to smaller actually does increase the potential that the placebo of using local government trust might have been different, because you would be actually asking people in smaller locales about their municipal government, and those smaller municipalities maybe experience a higher level of trust or something like that. So it's interesting that kind of across the two, and thinking about the lessons from both together gives you, I think, maybe even some enhanced confidence in the test about local trust in local municipal governments, drawing on the insights from the other paper, right, in the way that they speak to each other. So I'm going to see if there's anyone who has um, another question. We have about 7 minutes left, so we have plenty of time for that.
So I have a quick two fingers, if that's possible.
Yeah.
So that the point about the location, the geographic location, is quite interesting, because in the case of Regina and Michael, they need covariate balance for their design, and there are clear imbalances in terms of the geographic location of survey respondents before and after. But in our design, because we don't require covariate balance, but we require a smooth transition, we can tolerate imbalances. But what is happening is that at the cutoff, there is not a jump, right? There is a smooth transition. Things are changing a lot, but at the cutoff, the continuity assumption holds. So it's quite interesting that that's something that might be an issue, right? And need to be addressed for one of the design doesn't become an issue for the other. But yeah, we also saw that there were clear gaps in terms of, I think we checked for rural and urban, and we saw those gaps. But for geographic distance, I think we used the census point, or I don't remember exactly how it's called, the sampling point that LabPro provide, and we didn't find an abrupt change at the cutoff. So just wanted to mention that.
I'm also curious to hear a little bit more about how each team came to realize about this potential. I know that the day after the election, I was just like crying and sad. I was not thinking about research and kind of what things were in the field and all of this. So I'm also curious about the discovery process and at how it was that someone on each of your teams realized, oh, they had teams in the field fielding these questions about trust in the United States right around the time of the election and spanning that. And was that something that you went looking for and thought was there, or you were working with the LAPOP data on other questions and just realized it and figured it out? So I'm also curious in the origin story of each of the projects.
Sure. I'm happy to jump in. Yeah. So Michael and I definitely did not start working on this right after the 2016 election. I myself then left academia for about a year and a half and went and ran for office, and then have now come back. So I was doing quite different things for a while there as a result of the election. However, since coming back, then I'd moved to the University of Ottawa. And in my very first semester of teaching here, pretty early in the semester, I was teaching this class about violence in Latin America for master's students. So this started with master's students, and I gave them some assignments about LAPO because it's a great set of data, as hopefully your listeners have gleaned from this conversation. They're incredibly transparent about their data collection. The questions are great. The amount of information that you can get and understand about the survey itself is fantastic. Highly recommended. And all or almost all of their data is free and accessible to all of us. I find it a really nice tool for teaching as well, because there are interactive ways of looking at the data right on their website that someone doesn't necessarily have to know a lot of statistics to engage with it. So I had my students doing a project where they were looking at a particular country and year of the LabWeb data, and they were telling us about the technical information after they read through it and sharing a bit about what LabWeb did in their country and their year. And the students gave these presentations, And then I realized when I was sitting there listening to them and they were telling me the dates that LAPMOP was in the field in particular countries, I think first it was El Salvador that came up. First, because they only selected some countries for their presentation. And at that point, I thought, oh, that's really interesting. Huh, that sounds to me like a natural experiment. And then started looking into it more, started talking to Michael, and then we started working on the paper from there.
So I met Miguel Carreras in a conference, I think in 2017, and he happened to be a reviewer for a paper I have at BJPS. We talked a little bit about that, and we decided to start working on something together. And probably a couple of months after that, Miguel talked about this. Maybe we can check if there is survey data that was implemented during the election. And then I found that these 4 or 5 countries, right, depending on the approach, where the fieldwork happened during the election. And Igor, he's a grad student now. He was a grad student. He's on the market now. Also joined the project, right? And we ended up like writing this paper. I think it took like a year or something. I was just starting here, so as my first year, we were also with a baby, so maybe it took more time than we were expecting. And also, I think this is something interesting that if we have time, we were not sure about writing a short paper or like a traditional paper. So we presented as a traditional paper in MPSA, I think in 2019, and the discussants say this should be a short. I don't see the point of having like a long theory. This should be a short paper. And we were not super sure about that at the beginning, but I think it worked out. I still think that reviewers need to also be ready to review short papers. It happened. We submitted once as a short paper, was rejected. And a lot of the comments were, where is the theory? So we were not sure about what to do, right? Some people are asking for a theory, or people are saying, well, you don't need a theory because this is just an empirical finding. So it was a very interesting learning process, I have to say.
I know we have to wrap up. I just wanted to say quickly, though, we've also been asked, where's the theory? What's the theory in this repeatedly? So it's funny to just hear that you guys encountered that as well. And yeah, we definitely, once we started working on this, felt like a fit as a short paper more. But it was very hard. It was still very hard to fit everything into the space. And we ended up spilling out into an appendix quite a lot because there's a lot there. But I just wanted to say to you that there is a small, I think, cottage industry now of papers that use the 2016 election, leveraged sometimes in slightly different ways, but they basically use it as a natural experiment. So I just wanted to give a brief shout out to a paper by Minkus, Deutschman, and Deli, which is from 2019. That looks at how the election seems to have changed views about the EU, actually. And then there's another paper, let's see here, that I have here about global racist contagion is in the title, and it's by Gianni and Mayone from 2019 also. And they look at how attitudes about race changed after the election.
I think this is all really helpful. And I think it's great to make more transparent these experiences of doing the research and this issue of what fits into a letter or a short research note versus a longer paper, I think is something that I see a lot of authors dealing with as a challenge submitting to the APSR, because generally the shorter pieces don't have as much space for theoretical development. And we certainly don't expect that. But sometimes it's hard. Reviewers have strong norms and expectations. And so it's hard if you get some old school reviewers that aren't as comfortable with the shorter format or the more narrow kind of contribution that letters or shorter formats usually entail. I see that as a struggle, and also satisfying all the robustness and confirming that you have a real scientist. Unless there's anyone who has one last burning question that they want to put in the chat or unmute and ask. All right, I'm going to thank you both for joining us today. We really enjoyed the talk. I think there's also, Lynn is putting a short 2 or 3 question survey in the chat for our attendees and our upcoming events. I will mention that next week, we're excited to have an event in person in the Spark space. It's going to be a workshop. We will also have, as part of that, a public talk that will be virtual and streamed and in person. And so that is all on our website as well, if you want to follow up. So thank you again, Giancarlo and Regina, for joining us and for a great conversation today.
Thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you, Regina.
Okay, thank you so much for the opportunity. Nice to see you all.